Chava Willig-Levy here with part 2 of our week of podcasts honoring, through the sung and spoken word, Reverend Martin Luther King's legacy, his quest for that still elusive equality, emancipation, and freedom. Speaking of freedom, I wish I could say that today's podcast is going to showcase jovial, feel-good songs that might convince some Americans that brotherhood reigns between its black and white citizens. Feel-good songs like
Freedom, 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 freedom. Freedom is an ocean, sweeping the nation. Freedom is a body's imagination. Freedom is a full-time occupation. Freedom's in the state of mind.
That musical snippet was Freedom from the 1975 Broadway musical Shenandoah, with music by Gary Geld and lyrics by Peter Udell. I saw the show when I was 23, and that song, sung by a white woman played by Donna Theodore, and an adorable little black boy played by Chip Ford, brought the house down. 46 years later, I know that freedom that is only in a state of mind is insufficient. That is why today's two musical offerings are not feel-good songs. Although heartbreaking, they must be heard. Both songs are about a gruesome stain on American history, lynching. First, here is Supper Time by Irving Berlin from the 1933 musical review As Thousands Cheer. Introduced by the legendary Ethel Waters, the song is sung from the point of view of a black woman who is preparing dinner, having just learned that her husband was killed by a deranged lynch mob. Many artists have covered Supper Time, but in my opinion, none can rival Miss Waters' rendition. I had a difficult decision to make, whether to share an early recording of hers or a live performance many years later when she sang the song in a lower key, but with visceral pain that, in my opinion, seemed to be kept more under wraps in her earlier recording. So here is an older Ethel Waters performing the heartbreaking Supper Time.
Supper time, I must set the table 'cause it's supper time. Somehow I ain't able 'cause that man of mine ain't coming home no more. Supper time, kids will soon be yelling for their supper time. How I keep from telling them that man of mine ain't coming home no more. How I keep explaining when they ask me where he's gone. How I keep from crying when I bring their supper on. How can I remind them to pray at their humble board? How can I be thankful when they start to thank the Lord? Supper time, I set the table 'cause it's supper time. Somehow I ain't able 'cause that man of mine ain't coming home. No. How can I be thankful when they start to thank the Lord? Lord, supper time. I must set the table 'cause it's supper time. Somehow I ain't able 'cause that Lord ain't coming home no more.
Our next musical offering, recommended by my dear friend Pamela Moritz, is the harrowing Strange Fruit, written by Abel Meeropol in 1937 after he saw a photo of a lynching and made famous by Billie Holiday in 1939. Wikipedia informs me that the song, comparing lynching victims to the fruit of trees, has been called, quote, a declaration of war, unquote, and, quote, the beginning of the civil rights movement, unquote. It was also included in the Songs of the Century list of the Recording Industry of America and the National Endowment for the Arts. Here is Billie Holiday's iconic recording of Strange Fruit.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh, the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here's a strange and bitter
Today's podcast concludes, as will every podcast this week, with riveting spoken words about discrimination. Here is an excerpt from E.R. Braithwaite's autobiographical novel, To Sir with Love. Before Mr. Braithwaite became a celebrated teacher in a London inner-city school, he was a World War II hero. After the war, as an extremely qualified engineer, he began looking for employment. This excerpt describes what happened after one of his many job interviews. Quote, "And then it was all over. Mr. Simmons, the gentleman who had welcomed me, leaned back in his chair and looked from one to another of his associates. They nodded to him, and he said, 'Mr. Braithwaite, my associates and I are completely satisfied with your replies and feel sure that in terms of qualification, ability, and experience, you are abundantly suited to the post we have in mind. But we are faced with a certain difficulty. Employing would mean placing you in a position of authority over a number of our English employees, many of whom have been with us a very long time, and we feel that such an appointment would adversely affect the balance of a good relationship which has always been obtained in this firm. We could not offer you that post without the responsibility, neither would we ask you to accept the one or two other vacancies of a different type which do exist, for they are unsuitable for someone with your high standard of education and ability. So I'm afraid we will not be able to use you.' At this, he rose, extending his hand in the courtesy of dismissal. I felt drained of strength and thought, yet somehow I managed to leave that office, navigate the passage, elevator, and corridor, and walk out of the building into the busy, sunlit street. I had just been brought face to face with something I had either forgotten or completely ignored for more than 6 exciting years: my black skin. It had not mattered when I volunteered for air crew service in 1940. It had not mattered during the period of flying training or when I received my wings and was posted to a squadron. It had not mattered in the hectic uncertainties of operational flying, of living and loving from day to day, brothered to men who, like myself, had no tomorrow and could not afford to fritter away today on the absurdities of prejudice. It had not mattered when, uniformed and winged, I visited theaters and dance halls, pubs and private houses. Yes, I had forgotten about my skin when I so eagerly discussed my post-war prospects with the careers officer. I had quite forgotten about it as I jauntily entered that grand, imposing building. Now, As I walked sadly away, I consciously averted my eyes from the sight of my face reflected fleetingly in the large plate glass shop windows. This podcast began with the saccharine song asserting that, quote, freedom's in the state of mind, unquote. But after reading those last words from the To Sir with Love excerpt, it occurred to me that, as sociologist Irving Goffman postulated in his compelling book, Stigma, quote, a stigmatized individual may consider himself, quote, normal, a human being like everyone else. At the same time, he may detect, and not without reason, that others do not accept him. And the kicker? As a product of the same society whose members stigmatize him, the stigmatized person subscribes to many of its attitudes, making him, quote, intimately alive to what others see as his failing, inevitably causing him, if only for moments, to agree that he does indeed fall short of what he really ought to be, unquote. Please join me on Thursday for our final tribute to Martin Luther King's legacy, which will feature songs and words of hope and pride. In the meantime, I'm signing off for now with songs and words in my heart.